In this last video lecture, let's talk a few minutes about democracy and politics in Latin America since roughly the 1990s. So the last video lecture, we talked about the economic history and the rise of neoliberalism. And here, we're going to talk about the transition to democracy. If you remember, from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s, Latin America, many countries were ruled by military dictatorships. Those military dictatorships, during the economic crisis of the 1980s, they began to fall one by one throughout the region. And there was a political opening that went alongside the economic opening. And by the 1990s, Latin America had slowly implemented more democratic political systems. And political parties, labor unions, civic organizations, they began to flourish in this atmosphere. And there was a return to constitutionalism. And every country across the region, except for Cuba, sought to establish the rule of law. And what I want to go over here now are the principles of the rule of law. And these are challenges that Latin America still faces today. And many countries are still trying to implement the rule of law and the ideals that surround it. And first here I have on the slide, a key principle of the rule of law is the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. During much of the mid-20th century, the executive was the all-powerful, and usually the executive controlled much of Congress and the judicial branch as well. This was certainly the case in places like Mexico, where the official political party, the PRI, dominated all the branches of government. And today, there's still challenges. So in Mexico, for example, the legislative and the executive branches are certainly independent, and there's a separation of power, but the judicial branch in Mexico is quite weak and still trying to strengthen itself and its independence. But on the other hand, in Brazil, the judicial branch is quite strong and quite independent. So it just depends on from country to country how these separation of powers are playing out. And a second key principle of the rule of law is that all laws are applied equally and fairly, and no one is above the law. Now, this is an ideal, and as we all know, there's people in every country, including the United States, who get special treatment before the law. And particularly the wealthy and the powerful in Latin America have historically been above the law, and in many respects, many are today. But nonetheless, over particularly the last decade, there's been some really high-profile corruption cases in Latin America where the judicial branch has come down hard on politicians who have committed corruption. In Brazil, the big corruption case is called Lava Jato, where all these politicians were implicated in taking bribes and kickbacks from the state-owned oil company. And high-profile politicians have been put in jail, and that's part of making everybody equal to the rule of law, and that nobody's above the law. But nonetheless, a lot of people still do get away with committing crimes and not being punished for things like corruption. And corruption, of course, is a big issue in Latin American politics today, and getting rid of corruption. And little by little, I think there has been some improvement at chipping away at corruption, at least exposing it. And there's high profile prosecutors who go after big politicians, and particularly in Brazil in the last decade has seen this. And another principle of the rule of law is that the law is made by representatives in an open and transparent way, and subject to open and free criticism by the people. So, of course, it's like a representative democracy, and when laws are made, they can be criticized, and with people not fearing reprisals from the government for doing so. And so all of Latin America is struggling to achieve these principles, and other things like freedom of the press and freedom of the speech. These are all kind of principles of the rule of law, things that I think a lot of seem like we might take for granted here in the United States because it's so ingrained into our political system. But Latin America is struggling to create this. And we had to break down the countries in Latin America according to which ones are democratic and which ones are less so. I think the most democratic countries are Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. These are countries that have been able to establish many of these principles of the rule of law. And then the middle of the road is probably where the majority of the countries fall. They're democratic countries, but they have significant challenges that still remain. So Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, the four largest countries, and also Peru, El Salvador, Panama, and Guatemala. There's still corruption. Of course, the drug war undermines the rule of law and the power and strength of the drug cartels. So significant challenges in all those countries. And, even in Mexico today, journalists have been quite a number of journalists have been killed over the last several years, particularly by the drug cartels. So that hampers the freedom of speech and the freedom of journalists to write and publish what they want. So big challenges remain even for these middle of the road countries. And then the least democratic countries in the region are, of course, Cuba, which Cuba was the one country who never sought to establish the rule of law. They never went along with this program, of course, still being ruled by the communist Castro regime. In Venezuela, of course, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, is a country where the rule of law has suffered, and likewise with Nicaragua as well. First, I want to talk about Cuba during its special period in the 1990s. And the special period, it refers to when Cuba's economy greatly suffered in the early 1990s. Its economy contracted by about a third in the early 90s, and this had to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you recall, from several weeks ago, the Soviet Union had subsidized and supported the Cuban economy ever since the late 1960s, and Cuba became dependent on that for its economic growth throughout the 70s and the 1980s. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, all those subsidies and all that economic support came to an end, and Cuba was left on its own, and its economy contracted severely. And in 3 years, in the early 1990s, the country lost 70% of its imports. Industry and agriculture were paralyzed, and particularly it was the loss of imported fuel from the Soviet Union. So there was no oil, no gasoline in Cuba in the early 1990s. And this is when bicycles replaced cars in the streets of Havana. That's why I've put the image here, because you see a bicycle. There was no gas to put in cars in the early 1990s in Cuba. The U.S. embargo still existed, and Cuba could not buy gas from the United States. And even if it could have, it would not have had much money to do so during that period. And a lot of people predicted that the communist regime in Cuba would collapse like they were doing in Eastern Europe at the time. But the communist regime reinvented itself and began to carry out some reforms that allowed it to retain power. And so there was still very few political freedoms on the island ever since the Castro regime came to power. But beginning in the 1990s, the government began to open up its economy, parts of the economy, to foreign investment, and particularly in the tourist sector. And this allowed foreigners, not Americans, because Americans were barred from going to Cuba, but Canadians, Europeans, Australians, Asians, and other Latin Americans, of course, they could go to Cuba and enjoy the Caribbean beaches. And so part of the economy was privatized, particularly in the tourism industry, but there were limits to this private enterprise, and it was still in many ways controlled by at least the pace of the privatization was controlled by the Cuban government. And tourism today plays a strong role in Cuba's economy. And things like food rationing, however, have continued, and it's the embargo goes. The U.S. embargo with trade with Cuba goes on today, and so the Castro regime remains in power, even though Fidel died several years ago. His brother Raúl Castro, in many respects, is still the head of the Cuban regime. Finally, here I want to talk about what's called the Pink Tide, and this takes place particularly in the 2000s, but it goes on into the 2010s. And the Pink Tide refers to leftist governments that came to power in the 2000s through elections. And it's pink because they're leftists, but they're not like the communists, the red communists of the mid-20th century. So they're leftists, but they're not seeking to overthrow the system like they had done with the revolutionary movements in the mid-20th century and during the Cold War. Instead, they're coming to power through elections, and they're not as radical as the old communists, but nonetheless, many of them are going to promote socialist policies. And particularly in South America was where these governments came to power. And they, as I mentioned, they came to power through elections because there was a backlash to the rise of neoliberalism in the 1990s. The transition to neoliberalism, there had been a lot of hardships. There was political corruption, there was fewer government services. Poverty remained a big problem and inequality throughout the region. And so a lot of people rejected neoliberalism, and particularly all of these leftist politicians who came to power. And some of these leftist politicians were former revolutionaries. So here you have some of the most prominent ones that I've put here on the slide. On the left is Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, and he was the most radical of them all. And Chavez would ally Venezuela with Cuba, and he set himself on a path to clash with the United States in Washington, D.C., particularly after September 11th, when he criticized the U.S. policies towards in the war on terror and towards Afghanistan and then Iraq. And the history of Chavismo in Venezuela is a long one, but when oil prices were high throughout much of the 2000s, Chavez remained quite popular, and he became more authoritarian as the opposition tried to overthrow him in a coup in 2002. And there was a big oil strike because the oil unions were controlled by the old politicians. And they tried to bring down Chavez. And as these confrontations continued, and of course Washington supported the old political regime and the conservatives, Chavez became more authoritarian, so clamping down on the opposition and the opposition press as well. And he continued to hold on to power. There would be constitutional referendums where he would be allowed to remain in power. And he was quite popular, particularly in the early 2000s, despite, there was many people who fervently resisted him and hated him as well in Venezuela. But he would win these elections, and as long as oil prices were high, the Venezuelan regime could deliver economic reforms such as investing in public health care. And poverty did decrease in Venezuela in the 2000s. There was literacy campaigns, and there was accompanied a lot of class conflict in Venezuela and polarization as well. But when oil prices began to slump in the 2010s, that was when the Venezuelan regime particularly started to suffer. And of course, Chavez died of cancer in the early 2010s, and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, took over. And Venezuela, over the last near 10 years, has really suffered economic hardships. It could never transition away from just depending on oil. It was very much a petro-state and depended on oil exports. And when oil prices collapsed, Venezuela's economy really started to suffer. And there was, of course, economic mismanagement by the politicians who made the crisis even worse. And the Chavista regime remains in power today. And to the right of Chavez is Evo Morales, who was the president of Bolivia beginning in the mid-2000s. And he retained power until just recently when he lost an election. And Evo Morales was the first indigenous president of Bolivia. And Bolivia, if you remember, is a very highly indigenous country. And he wasn't as radical as Chavez, and in particular, he criticized the drug war. And he pursued a lot of policies such as redistributing wealth, and he would renegotiate the contracts with foreign gas companies. There's a lot of natural gas in Bolivia. And he would renegotiate these contracts to make them more favorable to the state. So the government's not taking over the gas industry and nationalizing it like it had in the mid-20th century, but was renegotiating contracts so that there was more revenues for the Bolivian government. And third to the right is Lula. Ignacio Lula da Silva from Brazil, and he was president in the 2000s, and he was extremely popular in Brazil, and he had been an old socialist, and the world investors were very scared when he came to power that he was going to implement all these socialist policies in Brazil, but he was kind of a middle of the road leftist, And he pursued redistributive policies. They built healthcare clinics. They would actually give families subsidies just to send their children to school where they could be educated, and where they would pay them, give them money as well if they would just send their children to a doctor where they could have better health. And this lifted millions of people out of poverty in Brazil. And he was a 2-term president, and he was extremely popular. And Brazil, though, after he left office, and there was an economic crisis in the mid-2010s, and Brazil particularly has had a hard time ever since then. Its economy has grown very slowly since the economic crisis in the mid-2010s, when commodity prices decreased. And but nonetheless, he was probably the most popular president in Brazil since Getulio Vargas in the mid-20th century. And to the right is Rafael Correa. He was president of Ecuador. Now, these were leftist governments that came to power, particularly in South America, but there still remain many governments who were ruled by conservatives. And particularly Mexico, for much of the 2000s and 2010s, was ruled by conservatives. Only recently in Mexico, in 2018, did a leftist win. So you still have both sides that are competing electorally for power in Latin America. And whether or not the pink tide is still going on kind of remains to be seen. I mean, I think we could say the pink tide kind of did come to an end in the 2010s, but we'll see. Competitive elections remain competitive throughout the region as all these countries seek to establish democratic regimes and the rule of law.